Basement Ritual and Transformation. The stone stairs groaned under the rhythmic, heavy tread of Mark's boots. He hauled Rachel by the hair, her neck craned at an unnatural angle, her skin ghostly and translucent under the flickering glow of the basement's low-hanging, iron-caged bulbs. Behind her, Jack shoved Sarah, who stumbled, her heels scraping against the jagged, uneven concrete of the subfloor. The air down here was different, viscous, heavy with the metallic tang of drying blood and the ozone scent of spent sorcery. The basement was a subterranean cathedral of misery, arched ceilings weeping cold condensation that pooled in the dark corners where shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. David stood at the center of a circular chalk sigil, his hands clasped behind his back, looking not like a captor, but like a professor preparing a lecture. He did not look at them as they were thrown to the floor. Instead, he traced a finger along a jagged line etched into the stone, his eyes glowing with a faint, sickly amber light. "You have such a vibrant, chaotic pulse," David said, his voice smooth, carrying effortlessly through the damp silence. He turned, his gaze sliding over them like a razor blade. "Most people go through life like flickering candles in a gale. You too, you burn with a stubborn, irritating intensity. It's why you're here." Mark kicked Sarah in the ribs, sending her sprawling toward the center of the ring. "Get up, little pet. The master is speaking." Sarah wheezed, clutching her side. Her breathing was hitching, a ragged sound that didn't match the heartbeat Rachel could suddenly hear, a frantic, fluttering bird trapped in Sarah's chest. Rachel reached out, her fingers clawing at the concrete, her nails breaking against the stone. She tried to scream, but the air in her lungs felt like sludge. "Don't," Rachel rasped. Her voice sounded strange and hollow, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep, dry well. David chuckled, a sound devoid of mirth. He knelt, his presence pressing down on the room like a physical weight. "Do you feel that, Rachel? The way your skin crawls? The way the shadows seem to reach out for you? You aren't just surviving anymore. You are becoming." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His teeth, white and impossibly sharp, glinted in the dim light. "You think you're human. You think you're high school girls who went on an ill-advised boat trip. That girl died the moment Mark's teeth pierced your vein. What remains is clay. And I am the sculptor." He gestured to the periphery of the room. It was only then that Rachel's eyes adjusted, her pupils dilating until the world washed out into shades of gray and crimson. Tethered to the pillars were their friends, the survivors of their group, gaunt and trembling, eyes wide with the hollow stare of the shell-shocked. "The ritual requires a foundation," David continued, pacing the perimeter of the chalk. "To bind a soul to the dark, one must witness the unraveling of the light. You have such fierce attachments, don't you? Such beautiful, pathetic loyalty." Mark laughed, a wet, guttural sound, and drew a long, curved blade from his belt. He walked over to the nearest tethered captive, a boy named Ben, who had been the life of their high school parties. Ben's eyes locked onto Rachel's, pleading, terrified. "No," Sarah shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her movements fluid and predatory despite her fear. She lunged for Mark, but Jack caught her by the shoulder, his grip like a steel trap. He spun her around, holding her fast, forcing her to watch. "Look," David commanded. The word wasn't a suggestion, it was an anchor, dragging their wills into the mud. Rachel felt her muscles lock. Her jaw tightened, her tongue feeling too large for her mouth, her teeth shifting against her gums, pushing against the soft tissue of her lips. She couldn't look away. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows elongating into spindly, grasping fingers. She felt a sickening surge of cold power, a hunger that wasn't for food, but for the very essence currently leaking from her friends. "You are not just victims, girls," David whispered, standing directly behind them now, his voice a soft, poisonous caress in their ears. "You are the fuel. This isn't just about killing, it's about transition. By witnessing this, by holding their terror inside you as they fade, you finalize the change. You become the apex of the design. Mark raised the blade. Shall we start with the pretty one? The horror didn't just wash over them, it sank into their marrow. Rachel could hear the blood pumping through Ben's neck, a rhythmic drum that screamed for release. It was deafening. It was all she could hear. She wanted to stop it, but a darker, quieter part of her, the part David had unlocked, was salivating. She wasn't just a witness. She was becoming a participant. "This is the price of your curiosity," David murmured, his hand settling on Rachel's shoulder, his touch burning like dry ice. "You wanted to see what was behind the veil. Now, you'll never be able to look away." As Mark stepped forward, the basement walls seemed to bleed, the stone itself weeping black ichor. The atmosphere was no longer just tense, it was a pressurized chamber of dark intent. Rachel felt her humanity fraying, a tapestry being pulled apart thread by thread, leaving only a cold, sharp, and ravenous void beneath. "Watch," David commanded, and for the first time, Rachel found that she couldn't remember why she wanted to close her eyes. She wanted, with a terrifying, agonizing clarity, to know exactly what was coming next. The basement smelled of wet earth, iron, and things that had been rotting since before the house was built. Mark shoved Rachel forward, her knees hitting the jagged stone floor with a sickening crunch. Beside her, Sarah gasped, stumbling as Jack yanked her chain, pulling her taut. David stood at the center of the chamber, his silhouette framed by the flickering, sickly green luminescence of a dozen candles placed in a perfect circle. He looked like a statue carved from ancient grief, his eyes devoid of anything resembling warmth. "The vessel must be emptied before it can be filled," David murmured. His voice wasn't loud, but it crawled through the room, vibrating in the marrow of Rachel's bones. "Please," Sarah choked out, her voice raw. She looked toward the corner, where the rest of their friends lay, bound, terrified, their faces gaunt with shock. "They don't know anything. Let them go. Take us, just stop this." Mark laughed, a sharp, wheezing sound that scraped against the silence. He walked over to one of the boys, pulling a serrated blade from his belt. "Hear that, Jack? She's offering herself. How noble. How utterly, pathetically human." Without warning, Mark drove the blade into the boy's shoulder. The scream that erupted was swallowed almost instantly by the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the cellar. David didn't flinch. He raised a hand, and the green flames flickered, casting elongated, dancing shadows that seemed to peel themselves off the damp walls. "Watch, children," David commanded. He gestured, and the thralls, once their friends, now glassy-eyed and hollow, stepped forward. Under David's subtle, rhythmic chanting, they moved with a jerky, puppet-like synchronicity. They reached for the captives, their hands trembling not with mercy, but with the cold, hunger-driven obedience of the damned. Rachel tried to lunge for Mark, to fight back, but an invisible weight pinned her to the stone floor. It felt as though the very air had turned to concrete. She could only watch as the ritual unfolded. It was a systematic stripping away of their world. One by one, the coven forced the elixir down the throats of her classmates, a viscous, black bile that hissed upon contact with their lips. The transformation wasn't the romanticized nonsense of stories. It was a violent, convulsive rejection of biology. Bones snapped and reformed with the sound of dry branches breaking underfoot. Skin turned gray, translucent, and then hardened like parchment. "Your loyalty is your greatest weakness," David said, pacing toward Rachel. He stopped, his face inches from hers. He smelled of ozone and ancient dust. "You watch them become shells, and you feel the tether of your humanity fraying. Good. Suffering is the kiln in which the strongest blades are forged." He signaled to Jack. The vampire reached into a stone basin near the altar, pulling out a heavy, chalice-like vessel filled with the same dark, pulsing liquid. "Hold her," David ordered. Mark pinned Rachel's arms behind her back, his grip like a vice. Sarah screamed, thrashing against her own restraints, her eyes streaming with tears that turned to blood as the stress of the environment began to overwhelm her systems. "Rachel, don't look at them. Look at me," Sarah shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the chanting of the coven, a low, guttural drone that seemed to be pulling the very heat from the room. David tilted Rachel's head back. His fingers were ice-cold against her jaw. "The transition requires a void. You must be bled dry of your past, of your warmth, of your heartbeat." He brought the chalice to her lips. The smell was revolting, stagnant water and copper. Rachel clamped her mouth shut, her jaw aching with the effort. "Force her," David said, his tone indifferent. Mark slammed his palm against the side of Rachel's face, snapping her teeth together. The pain was blinding, white-hot, and in that moment of weakness, David poured the liquid. It burned. It didn't just go down her throat. It felt as though liquid lead was pouring into her veins, searing her lungs, boiling her blood. She collapsed, her body seizing as the elixir took hold. She felt her heartbeat, the steady, rhythmic thump that had been her companion for 17 years, stutter. It skipped. It slowed. It labored against the invading cold, fighting, then slowing further, until it was a faint, distant drum in a cavernous hall. She rolled onto her side, clawing at her chest. She couldn't breathe, but she didn't need to. Her lungs felt redundant. Across the room, she heard a similar, wet choke. "Sarah." "Now," David whispered, stepping back into the shadows of the circle. "Let the rot take root. Let the new life claim the wreckage." The pain didn't stop. It evolved. It moved from her veins into her marrow, a deep, invasive ache that felt like her DNA was being rewritten, shredded, and stitched together by invisible, serrated needles. She saw flashes of her life, a birthday party, a bicycle ride, the smell of rain on pavement, and watched them dissolve into gray ash. She looked at her hand. The skin was pale, deathly so, and the veins beneath the surface were pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent violet light. She looked at Sarah. Her friend was trembling, her fingernails digging deep furrows into the dirt floor, her eyes wide, the irises losing their brown hue and shifting into a predatory, fractured gold. Mark loomed over them, his sadistic grin wider than ever. He paced around them like a shark circling wounded prey. "Look at them, Jack. The fledglings are fighting the change. It's so much more fun when they scream, isn't it?" He reached out, his hand hovering over Sarah's throat, testing the air. "I think I'll keep this one's vocal cords for a souvenir. Maybe keep her around for a few centuries just to hear her beg." Rachel heard the words, but they felt distant, filtered through a veil of static. The rage that began to build wasn't the hot, impulsive anger of a teenager. It was something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. It was an instinct. A hunger that pulsed in the back of her brain, demanding release. She looked at the stone floor, then at the heavy iron bars of the basement window high above. The world seemed different now. She could hear the skittering of beetles behind the walls, the heartbeat of a rat trapped in the floorboards 3 rooms away, the frantic, terrified pulse of a coven member standing by the door. The sound of David's heartbeat was the loudest, a slow, steady, arrogant thrum that felt like an insult to her own chaotic, newly awakened senses. "I am not a commodity," she thought, the words echoing with a strange, reverberating power. Her muscles, previously weak from the torture, suddenly felt coiled and ready, charged with a latent, violent potential. The agony of the ritual remained, but it had shifted from a burden into a weapon. She felt the hunger, a deep, hollow ache in her gut, and realized with a sickening clarity that she didn't just want to escape. She wanted to tear the world apart. David turned, sensing the shift in the room. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he looked down at the 2 girls. "The transition is accelerating," he murmured, his voice laced with a hint of concern. "Hold them. If they break the shackles, kill them." Mark stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, his blade raised. "With pleasure." Rachel didn't wait for him to move. As his hand reached for her collar, she moved. It wasn't a human movement. It was a blur of speed that left an afterimage in the dim candlelight. Her hand shot out, her fingers catching Mark's wrist with a strength that crushed bone. The sound of his shriek was cut short as she swung him around, using his own momentum to slam him into the stone wall. The impact shook the basement, dust raining down from the ceiling. Sarah was up an instant later, her movements just as fluid, her face a mask of cold, hard focus. She didn't look like the terrified girl who had raced to the mainland. She looked like a predator that had finally found its teeth. The coven fell silent. David's calm, mask-like expression finally cracked. "So," David said, his voice dropping an octave, resonant with a dark, ancient authority. "The fledglings have teeth." Rachel stood, her body swaying as she acclimated to the newfound strength coursing through her limbs. She looked at her hands, then at the blood-stained walls, and finally, directly at David. The moral ambiguity of her situation didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the cold, unyielding need to survive, to consume, and to destroy the forces that had turned her life into this dark, ritualistic cage. She felt the hunger shift into a growl that vibrated in her chest. The game had changed. The hunters were about to find out exactly what they had created. The stone floor was an ice-licked grave. Rachel's lungs burned, a phantom sensation of drowning that had no business existing in a body that had ceased to beat. She pushed upward, her fingernails scraping against the porous, mold-choked limestone of the basement floor. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the dull tap of keratin against rock. It was the sharp, metallic scritch of talons. Beside her, Sarah was a tangle of limbs, convulsing as the elixir, that thick, copper-heavy sludge David had poured down their throats, settled into her marrow. "Sarah?" Rachel's voice emerged as a rasp, but it hit her own ears with a strange, subsonic resonance. She reached out, her hand trembling. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't just the smell of rotten old iron anymore. Rachel could smell the vibration of the room. She could smell the ancient, suffocating perfume clinging to David's robes from across the chamber, and the sharp, metallic tang of Mark's sweat, a scent that now triggered a violent, involuntary hunger that tore through her belly like a hook. "Don't," Sarah hissed. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't human. The iris had bled out into a swirling, bruised violet, the pupils blown wide until the entire eye seemed like a bottomless well of ink. Sarah looked at her own hands, then at the shadows deepening in the corners of the room. "I can hear them," Sarah whispered, her head tilting at an impossible angle. "The rats in the walls. They're loud." "They're terrified," Rachel replied. The realization shocked her. She wasn't just hearing the scuttling, she was feeling the frantic, high-pitched rhythm of the vermin's hearts. It was a symphony of prey. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah choked out, trying to scramble up. Her balance was a wreck, her muscles coiled with a terrifying, kinetic tension. She slammed into a stone pillar, the impact sounding like a sledgehammer hitting marble. The stone cracked, spider webbing outward from where her shoulder made contact. She didn't even flinch. She just stared at the damage, mesmerized. "You're adapting quite nicely," a voice echoed from the gloom. David stood near the ritual dais, his silhouette framed by the dying embers of the braziers. He looked bored, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat. Mark and Jack stood a few paces behind him, their expressions masks of predatory amusement. "The transition usually takes hours," David mused, stepping closer. "But then, I suppose the catalyst I provided was potent. You're hungry, aren't you? That's the first hurdle. The thirst is a cage. It defines you. It makes you mine." Rachel felt the hunger flare, a white-hot spike of agony that bypassed her rational mind and went straight for her throat. Her teeth ached, her gums stinging as sharp, needle-like fangs pressed against her lips. She lunged. It wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. She moved with a blur of speed that defied physics, closing the 20-foot gap before David could even blink. She didn't have a weapon, so she used her momentum, driving her shoulder into David's chest. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. David hit the far wall, stone dust raining down as he sank to the floor, his composure finally shattering into a jagged look of surprise. "Rachel, wait!" Sarah screamed. Though her own posture had shifted, she was crouching, ready to spring, her fingers hooked like claws. "They're not our masters," Rachel snarled, the words vibrating with a predatory hum. She stood over David, her vision swimming with a heat map of his veins, pulsing with a rhythmic, intoxicating beat. It was the sound of a drum, inviting her to feast. Mark lunged, his face contorting into a mask of rage. "Put her down, you fledgling." He swung a rusted iron chain, a relic from the basement's grim history, aimed squarely at Rachel's skull. Rachel didn't dodge. She caught it. The heavy links bit into her palm, drawing a trickle of black, viscous blood, but she didn't feel pain. She felt a surge of cold, intoxicating power. With a guttural roar that felt less like a scream and more like a challenge, she yanked the chain. The sudden force whipped Mark off his feet, slamming him into the low-hanging rafters. Wood splintered, and the ceiling groaned, debris cascading down upon them. "Sarah, now!" Rachel commanded, her eyes fixed on the shadows near the stairs. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a discarded iron stake from the ritual floor, the same one that had been used to hold their friends in place, and swung it with a precision that was entirely unnatural. She didn't aim for the vampires, she aimed for the light. She shattered the primary brazier, sending a wave of burning coals across the dry, rotted floorboards. Smoke erupted, thick and acrid, swirling into a blinding fog that filled the basement in seconds. "Kill them," David commanded from the floor, his voice dripping with venom. "Bring me their hearts if you have to, but do not let them leave this house." Jack leaped through the smoke, his movements fluid and feline. Sarah met him in midair. She didn't have the finesse of an ancient vampire, but she had the raw, unbridled desperation of a girl who had died and been reborn in the dark. She tackled him into a stack of shipping crates, the wood exploding under the force of their collision. "The exit," Sarah gasped, kicking Jack away and pinning him for a split second with the heavy stake. Rachel didn't look back. She saw the sliver of moonlight filtering down the cellar stairs, a beckoning, pale finger of light. It was the only thing in the world that mattered. They sprinted. Their feet barely touched the steps, their bodies moving with an effortless grace that allowed them to leap over the rotten wood, taking the stairs 3 at a time. The basement felt like a pressurized chamber behind them, the shouts of the vampires echoing like thunder. They burst through the heavy oak door and into the night. The air outside was crisp, smelling of salt and wet pine. For a heartbeat, they both stopped, standing on the edge of the overgrown lawn. The island looked different, every leaf was sharp, every shadow deep, every sound magnified. They could hear the distant wash of the tide against the shore, and deeper still, the heartbeat of the woods themselves. "We have to get to the boat," Rachel said, her voice shaking as she fought to keep her predatory instincts in check. The world was so bright now, the moonlight enough to see every vein on every leaf. "The skiff won't hold us both if we're this heavy," Sarah countered, looking down at her hands, still trembling with residual rage. "Rachel, I can hear them behind us. They're already moving." Rachel turned back toward the house. The windows were dark, but she could see the heat signatures of the coven rising toward the ground floor like smoke. "Then we don't just run," Rachel said, a new, cold clarity settling over her. "We disappear." She took Sarah's hand. Their skin felt like frozen marble, yet they were burning with an inner heat. As the front door of the house began to splinter under the pressure of the pursuers inside, the two girls turned and bolted into the thick, tangled woods of the island, moving faster than any human, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. A pair of monsters fleeing the ones who had made them, destined to become the very thing the darkness feared.